Somewhere in the world right now, someone is pouring a drink. Maybe it's champagne at a wedding in Paris, whiskey in a Glasgow pub, sake in a Tokyo izakaya, or homemade beer in a village where the recipe hasn't changed in 1,000 years. Alcohol is everywhere. It's woven into the fabric of human civilization so deeply that to tell its story is to tell our story. Every triumph, every tragedy, every moment of connection, and every descent into darkness. Before we begin this journey through 10,000 years of fermentation, fire, and consequences, hit that like button and subscribe. This is going to be a long one, and I want you here for every twist in this story. Now tell me, where are you tuning in from right now, and what time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments. I want to know if you're watching this at 3 in the afternoon with coffee or 3 in the morning when the world is silent. Phone face down, volume at a whisper. Let's go in. Imagine the Earth 12,000 years ago. The last ice age is ending. Glaciers are retreating. Forests are spreading across landscapes that were frozen wastelands just centuries before. And somewhere in the Fertile Crescent, in that ancient cradle between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, humans are learning to stop wandering. They're learning to plant seeds. They're learning to harvest grain. They're building the first permanent settlements, the first villages that will become cities, the first cities that will become empires. And in those early experiments with agriculture, in those first attempts to store surplus food for the winter, they discover something that will change everything. Fermentation. Nobody planned it. Nobody understood it. Nobody even knew what yeast was. It just happened. Grain stored in clay pots. Honey left in ceramic jars. Wild fruits crushed and forgotten in containers. And then something magical occurs. Microscopic organisms invisible to the naked eye consume the sugars in these foods and produce alcohol as a byproduct. The first human to taste fermented grain or fruit must have felt something extraordinary. A warmth spreading through the body. A lightness in the head. A loosening of the tight knot of daily survival. A sense of euphoria that nothing else in their world could provide. This wasn't just a discovery. It was a revelation. It was a doorway to an altered state of consciousness that could be achieved without ritual, without pain, without the dangerous consumption of plants that might kill you. Just wait. Just let nature do its work. And the result is magic in a cup. The earliest evidence we have of intentional alcohol production dates back to around 7000 BCE in the Yellow River Valley in China, where ancient peoples fermented rice, honey, and fruit into a primitive beer or wine hybrid. Chemical analysis of pottery shards shows residues of tartaric acid, a compound found in grapes and hawthorn berries, mixed with rice and honey. This wasn't accidental. Someone figured out that mixing these ingredients and letting them sit produced something wonderful. In the Zagros Mountains of Iran, archaeologists have found pottery jars at a site called Hajji Firuz Tepe with residue that proves humans were making wine from grapes as early as 5500 BCE. The jars have a yellowish residue on the interior that contains traces of tartaric acid and resin from the terebinth tree, which ancient peoples used as a preservative and flavoring agent. Someone in that village 6,000 years ago was not only making wine but was sophisticated enough to add resins to improve its quality and shelf life. In ancient Soma, in what is now southern Iraq, beer was so important that it appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest written stories, composed around 2100 BCE but drawing on much older oral traditions. When the wild man Enkidu, who lives among the animals, is brought to civilization, part of his transformation involves drinking beer and eating bread. The text describes him drinking 7 jugs of beer, after which his heart becomes light and his face glows. Beer, in the Sumerian worldview, is what separates humans from animals. It is the drink of civilization itself. Think about that for a moment. From the very beginning of recorded human thought, alcohol wasn't just a beverage. It was a marker of civilization, of culture, of humanity itself. To drink beer was to be human. To refuse beer was to remain in the wild. In ancient Egypt, beer was a dietary staple consumed by people of all social classes. Workers building the pyramids at Giza received rations of bread and beer as payment for their labor. The beer they drank wasn't like what we know today. It was thick, nutritious, slightly sweet, low in alcohol content, often consumed through a straw to avoid the sediment at the bottom of the vessel. It was safer to drink than water from the Nile, which could carry disease and parasites. Wine, made from grapes grown in the fertile Nile Delta and in oases, was more prestigious, reserved for the wealthy, the nobility, and the priesthood. The Egyptians believed that Osiris, god of the afterlife, agriculture, and resurrection, had given humanity the gift of beer. When pharaohs died, they were buried with dozens or even hundreds of jars of beer and wine to sustain them in the afterlife, to ensure they could continue to feast and celebrate in the world beyond death. Egyptian texts describe the process of brewing in detail. Barley was partially baked into loaves, then crumbled and mixed with water and allowed to ferment. Date syrup or honey might be added for sweetness. The result was nutritious enough that it was sometimes called liquid bread. Children drank it. Pregnant women drank it. The elderly drank it. Beer was life. But the Egyptians also knew the dangers. Medical papyri warn against excessive drinking. One text advises, "Do not indulge in drinking beer, lest you utter evil speech and don't know what you are saying." Another describes the sad fate of the drunkard. "You are like a broken steering oar in a ship, which obeys neither side. You are like a shrine without a god, like a house without bread." Even in the earliest civilizations, people understood that the substance that brought joy and connection could also bring ruin. This pattern repeats across every ancient civilization. In Mesopotamia, the goddess Ninkasi is the deity of beer, and the hymn to Ninkasi, composed around 1800 BCE, is both a religious text and a recipe, passed down through generations. It describes the process of brewing in poetic language, mixing water with barley, the bubbling of the fermenting wort, the pouring of the filtered beer. To sing the hymn was to honor the goddess and to remember the steps of brewing. Religion and practical knowledge were inseparable. In ancient Greece, wine becomes central to social and religious life in a way that shapes Western civilization for millennia. The Symposium, a drinking party for elite men, is where philosophy is debated, where politics is discussed, where poetry is composed and performed. Plato's Symposium, one of the foundational texts of Western philosophy, takes place entirely at a drinking party where Socrates and others debate the nature of love while consuming wine mixed with water. The Greeks almost never drank wine undiluted. To do so was considered barbaric. Proper wine was mixed with water in specific ratios, 2 parts water to 1 part wine, or 3 to 1, or 5 to 2, depending on the occasion and the desired level of intoxication. The Greeks worshipped Dionysus, god of wine, ecstasy, fertility, and theatre, a deity who represents both the joy and the danger of intoxication, both the creative liberation and the potential for chaos and violence. The cult of Dionysus involved ecstatic rituals where followers, often women called Maenads, would drink wine, dance themselves into trance states, and in mythology, were said to tear apart animals and even humans in their frenzy. Dionysus is a god who breaks boundaries, who dissolves the careful structures of civilized life, who reminds humans that beneath the order of society is something wild and dangerous. Euripides' play The Bacchae, written around 405 BCE, tells the story of what happens when a city tries to reject Dionysus. The result is madness, violence, and death. The message is clear: you cannot reject wine, you cannot reject intoxication, because to do so is to reject a fundamental part of human nature. You can only try to control it, to channel it, to keep it within boundaries. The Romans take this Greek wine culture and expand it into an empire. They plant vineyards across Europe, in Gaul, in Hispania, in Germania, in Britannia. Wherever the Roman legions go, grapevines follow. Roman soldiers receive a daily ration of wine called posca, wine diluted with water and sometimes mixed with herbs and honey. It's safer than water, provides calories, and makes the hardships of military life more bearable. Wine becomes currency. Wine becomes culture. Wine becomes power. The Roman elite develop a sophisticated wine culture that rivals anything we have today. They debate the quality of different vintages from different regions. They prefer wines from certain estates in Campania or Sicily. They age wine in amphorae sealed with cork and resin. They develop the language of connoisseurship, discussing the color, the aroma, the body, the finish. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder, in his Natural History, catalogues dozens of varieties of grapes and discusses the characteristics of wines from across the empire. But the Romans also see the dangers clearly. Roman writers describe alcoholics stumbling through the streets of Rome, families destroyed by a father's or husband's addiction, fortunes lost to drinking and gambling. The physician Galen, writing in the 2nd century CE, warns that excessive wine drinking damages the liver, inflames the brain, causes dropsy and gout and a host of other ailments. The philosopher Seneca writes about men who are drunk from dawn to midnight, who have lost all self-control, who are slaves to wine. The Roman satirist Juvenal mocks the drinking habits of wealthy Romans, describing dinner parties where guests drink themselves into oblivion and then vomit so they can drink more. He describes women drinking as heavily as men, something that violates traditional Roman values of female modesty and restraint. The subtext is clear. Excessive drinking is both a personal failing and a sign of moral decay in society. But here's the thing, despite the harm, despite the addiction, despite the violence and dysfunction that alcohol causes even in these ancient societies, it remains sacred. It remains central to religious life. It remains the substance that brings people together. Because alcohol does something that nothing else can do quite as well. It creates connection. It lowers the barriers between people. It turns strangers into friends, friends into brothers, individuals into communities. And in societies where life is hard, where most people are poor, where death is ever present, that connection, that brief respite from suffering, is precious beyond measure. In ancient China, alcohol made from fermented rice or millet becomes central to ritual and governance. The Shang dynasty, ruling from around 1600 to 1046 BCE, leaves behind elaborate bronze vessels specifically designed for serving and drinking alcohol during ancestor worship ceremonies. These vessels, some of which survive today in museums, are masterpieces of metallurgy and art, decorated with intricate designs of dragons and geometric patterns. They weren't utilitarian objects. They were sacred technology, designed to facilitate communication between the living and the dead, between the human and the divine, and alcohol was the medium of that communication. Confucius, the great philosopher and teacher who lived from 551 to 479 BCE, discusses alcohol in his writings. He doesn't advocate abstinence. Instead, he teaches that alcohol should be consumed with ritual propriety, with awareness of social context, in moderation, and always with respect for the occasion. The Analects, a collection of his sayings, mentions that Confucius drank wine but was never drunk to the point of confusion. The ideal is control, awareness, balance. Wine is good, but excess is dangerous. This becomes a foundation of Chinese thinking about alcohol for centuries. But theory and practice often diverge. Chinese history is full of stories of emperors and officials who drank themselves to death, of poets who wrote their best work while drunk, of peasants who sold everything they had to buy wine. The Tang dynasty, often considered the golden age of Chinese poetry, produces poets like Li Bai, who writes constantly about drinking and is said to have drowned while drunk, trying to embrace the reflection of the moon in a river. His most famous poem, Drinking Alone by Moonlight, captures the paradox of alcohol. It promises connection but is consumed in solitude. It promises transcendence but delivers only a temporary escape from the self. In India, the Vedic texts composed between 1500 and 500 BCE mention a ritual drink called Soma, which plays a central role in religious ceremonies. The exact identity of Soma is lost to history. Some scholars think it was an alcoholic beverage. Others think it might have been a psychedelic plant. Still others think it was a combination. But whatever it was, it represented divine intoxication, a way to commune with the gods, to transcend ordinary consciousness. The Rig Veda, oldest of the Vedic texts, contains dozens of hymns praising Soma, describing it as a divine nectar that brings strength, courage, wisdom, and immortality. But later Hindu and Buddhist traditions become more ambivalent about alcohol. The laws of Manu, composed around 200 BCE to 200 CE, forbid Brahmins from drinking alcohol. The Buddha includes abstinence from intoxicants as one of the 5 precepts for laypeople. The reasoning is clear: intoxication clouds the mind, and a clouded mind cannot achieve enlightenment, cannot see reality clearly, cannot escape the cycle of suffering. For traditions focused on mental clarity and self-discipline, alcohol becomes an obstacle, something to be avoided. Yet even in India, alcohol persists. Regional traditions of palm wine, rice beer, and distilled spirits continue, especially in tribal and lower caste communities where Brahminical restrictions hold less sway. As always, the relationship between ideals and reality is complicated. Among the Celtic peoples of northern and western Europe, mead made from fermented honey becomes the drink of warriors and kings, shared in great halls where bards sing of heroes and battles. The word honeymoon originates from the tradition of newlyweds drinking honey wine for a month after marriage to ensure fertility and happiness. In Norse mythology, the mead of poetry is a magical beverage that grants wisdom and poetic inspiration to anyone who drinks it. The god Odin goes to great lengths to obtain this mead, seducing a giantess and escaping in the form of an eagle. The message encoded in this myth is ancient and powerful. Alcohol is divine, alcohol is transformative, alcohol is worth any risk. The Norse sagas are full of drinking. Warriors feast in Valhalla, drinking mead served by Valkyries. Kings hold elaborate feasts where drinking horns are passed around and men boast of their deeds. But the sagas also show the dark side. Drunken insults lead to feuds that last generations. Men kill each other over slights delivered while drunk. The saga of Egil Skallagrimsson describes a feast where Egil, a great warrior and poet, is forced to drink toast after toast by a hostile king, and survives only through his enormous capacity for alcohol and his cunning. The subtext is clear. Alcohol is a test, a challenge, a battlefield in itself. Everywhere humans go, alcohol goes with them. When Polynesian peoples navigate thousands of miles of open ocean to settle remote islands across the Pacific, they bring with them the knowledge of fermentation. They make kava from the roots of Piper methysticum, a plant that produces a mildly intoxicating beverage central to social and ceremonial life. In Polynesian cultures, kava drinking is ritualized, used to welcome guests, seal agreements, communicate with ancestors and spirits. The circle of men passing the kava bowl becomes the center of community life. In sub-Saharan Africa, people ferment millet, sorghum, bananas, palm sap, whatever is locally available. In West Africa, palm wine tapped from palm trees is consumed fresh, slightly sweet and fizzy, low in alcohol but socially important. In East Africa, banana beer is brewed in quantities large enough to serve entire villages during celebrations. In southern Africa, sorghum beer, thick and nutritious, becomes a staple. Every culture finds a way to transform the plants around them into something intoxicating. It's universal. It's human. It's something we seem driven to do regardless of geography, climate, or technology level. Anthropologists have theorized about why fermentation and alcohol production is so universal. Some argue that discovering fermentation was economically important. It allowed early agricultural societies to preserve surplus grain and fruit, converting it into a stable, valuable commodity that wouldn't spoil. Some argue it had nutritional value. Fermented beverages contain B vitamins and other nutrients, and the fermentation process makes grain more digestible. Some argue it had religious and social functions, creating altered states of consciousness that facilitated ritual, strengthened social bonds, and marked important occasions. Likely all of these factors played a role. Alcohol succeeded because it served multiple purposes simultaneously. Now let's talk about the Middle Ages in Europe, because this is where alcohol becomes even more deeply embedded in daily life, where it transitions from being one beverage among many to being the primary beverage for most people most of the time. In medieval Europe, roughly from the 5th century to the 15th century, beer and wine aren't luxuries. They are necessities. Clean water is extraordinarily hard to find. Rivers are polluted with human and animal waste. Wells can be contaminated by seepage from cesspits. Diseases like cholera and typhoid spread through water supplies. But alcohol, because of the fermentation process and the fact that brewing involves boiling water, is relatively safe to drink. The alcohol content and the acidity make it hostile to most pathogens. So people drink beer and wine constantly. Children drink weak beer called small beer. Monks drink beer they brew themselves in monasteries. Peasants drink beer. Nobles drink wine. The quantity consumed is staggering by modern standards. In medieval England, The average adult consumes at least a gallon of beer per day, sometimes much more. That's 8 pints. Every day. Workers are paid partly in beer. Breakfast includes beer. Lunch includes beer. Dinner includes beer. People drink beer while working in the fields. Nobles and clergy drink wine, which is more expensive and more prestigious, but they still consume enormous quantities. Medieval banquets feature multiple courses, each accompanied by different wines, and guests are expected to drink heavily as a sign of the host's generosity and their own appreciation. The monasteries become centers of brewing and winemaking in medieval Europe. Benedictine monks, following the rule of Saint Benedict, are instructed to live lives of work and prayer, and part of that work involves producing food and drink for the monastery and for travelers and pilgrims. Monks in Belgium and Germany perfect the art of beer brewing, developing strong ales with complex flavors, creating styles that still exist today. Trappist monasteries continue to brew beer according to medieval traditions, and Trappist beers are considered among the finest in the world. Monks in France and Italy tend vineyards and produce wines that become legendary. The Champagne region, Burgundy, Bordeaux, the Rhine Valley, Tuscany, these aren't just places. They're monuments to centuries of careful cultivation by monks who had the time, the resources, and the dedication to perfect their craft. Medieval people also understand that alcohol is a preservative and that it has medicinal properties. They make fortified wines by adding distilled spirits, extending shelf life for long sea voyages. They infuse wines and beers with herbs and spices, creating medicinal beverages used to treat everything from indigestion to plague. Hildegard of Bingen, a 12th century abbess, mystic, and polymath, writes extensively about the medicinal uses of wine and beer in her medical texts. She recommends specific types of wine for specific ailments, prescribes beer for fevers, and warns against drinking to excess. Which brings us to one of the most important developments in the history of alcohol, distillation. Distillation is the process of heating a fermented liquid to separate alcohol from water, creating spirits that are much higher in alcohol content than beer or wine. The technique originates in the Middle East, probably among Arab and Persian alchemists in the 8th or 9th century CE, who are experimenting with ways to purify and concentrate substances. The word alcohol itself comes from Arabic, alcohol, originally meaning a fine powder of antimony used as eye makeup, later extended to mean any substance reduced to its pure essence, and eventually applied specifically to distilled spirits. The Arab world during the Islamic Golden Age is a center of scientific and medical advancement. Scholars translate Greek and Roman texts, conduct experiments, develop new techniques. One of these scholars, Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in the West as Geber, describes distillation processes in the 8th century. Another, Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, known as Rhazes, further develops distillation techniques in the 9th century. These scholars aren't trying to make beverages. They're trying to create medicines and to understand the fundamental nature of matter. But the techniques they develop will eventually revolutionize drinking. When this knowledge reaches Christian Europe in the late Middle Ages, transmitted through Spain where Muslim and Christian scholars interact, and through the Crusades which bring Europeans into contact with Arab learning, it transforms everything. By the 12th and 13th centuries, European alchemists and physicians are distilling wine to make Aqua Vitae, the water of life, believed to be a universal medicine capable of curing almost any disease. Early medical texts describe Aqua Vitae as miraculous, able to preserve youth, restore health, and extend life. But people quickly discover that Aqua Vitae isn't just medicine. It's also a very effective way to get drunk. And unlike beer or wine, which require drinking large volumes to achieve intoxication, spirits deliver high doses of alcohol quickly. This is both an advantage and a danger. By the 15th and 16th centuries, distillation technology spreads across Europe. Suddenly people can make brandy from wine, whiskey from barley, vodka from grain or potatoes, rum from molasses, gin from neutral spirits flavored with juniper. These drinks are stronger, more portable, more profitable. They're also more dangerous. A person can get drunk much faster on distilled spirits than on beer or wine. The potential for addiction increases dramatically. The potential for harm increases. By the 16th century, European cities are experiencing problems with spirits that wouldn't look out of place in the modern world. In London, gin becomes cheap and widely available. In Amsterdam, Geneva, the precursor to gin, floods the taverns. In Russia, vodka becomes central to social life and begins its long reign as the national drink and national curse. In Scotland and Ireland, whiskey production becomes a cottage industry, with families distilling spirits in remote glens and valleys to avoid taxes and government control. This is also the age of European exploration and colonization, and alcohol plays a crucial role in that process. Ships carrying European explorers, conquistadors, and colonists also carry barrels of wine, beer, and spirits. Alcohol is used to preserve water on long voyages. It's used as currency in trade with indigenous peoples. It's used as a weapon of conquest. In the Americas, European colonizers find that indigenous peoples have their own fermented beverages, corn beer, agave pulque, various fruit wines, but they don't have distilled spirits. The introduction of rum, whiskey, and brandy to Native American communities is catastrophic. Without cultural frameworks for managing highly intoxicating spirits, without a history of gradual adaptation to these substances, communities are destabilized. European traders deliberately use alcohol as a tool of exploitation, getting people drunk before negotiating land deals, using alcohol as payment for furs and other goods, creating dependency that can be exploited. The same pattern repeats in Africa, Asia, Australia. Wherever Europeans colonize, they bring alcohol, they use it as a tool of control, and they destabilize existing social structures. This isn't an accident. It's policy. Colonial administrators understand that alcohol can pacify populations, that addiction can be exploited, that a drunk person is easier to control than a sober one. In the Caribbean, the sugar plantations worked by enslaved Africans become centers of rum production. Molasses, the byproduct of sugar refining, is fermented and distilled into rum, which becomes one of the most profitable commodities in the Atlantic trade. Rum travels to Africa where it's traded for slaves. Slaves are transported to the Americas where they produce sugar. Sugar travels to Europe where it's consumed and processed, and molasses comes back to be made into rum. This triangular trade runs on sugar, slavery, and alcohol. The human cost is incalculable. Enslaved people work in brutal conditions to produce the sugar that makes the rum. Many are themselves given rum rations to make the horror of their lives slightly more bearable. Rum becomes associated with sailors, with pirates, with the violence and exploitation of the colonial project. The phrase rum, sodomy, and the lash will later be used to describe the British Navy, only half in jest. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe is awash in alcohol. In England, the average adult drinks more than a gallon of beer per day, plus wine and spirits on top of that. In Germany, beer halls become central to social life in every town, and the brewing industry becomes professionalized and regulated. In France, wine production is an enormous part of the economy, and the classification of vineyards and the development of famous wine regions accelerates. In Scotland and Ireland, whiskey production grows from a cottage industry into a major economic sector, though much of it remains illegal to avoid paying taxes to the English crown. In Russia, vodka becomes the dominant drink and begins to shape Russian culture in profound ways. Ivan the Terrible establishes state-run taverns called kabaks in the 16th century, giving the government a monopoly on vodka sales and creating a major source of tax revenue. The Russian government becomes dependent on vodka taxes, which means it has a financial incentive to encourage drinking. This creates a pattern that will persist for centuries. The Russian state simultaneously deplores drunkenness and profits from it, implements half-hearted reforms and then abandons them when tax revenues drop. And then comes the gin craze in 18th century England, which becomes the first modern drug epidemic and a harbinger of crises to come. In 1720, the British government passes laws that make gin production cheap and easy, requiring no license and no quality control. The intention is to support domestic grain farmers by creating demand for grain, and to reduce consumption of French brandy, since England and France are frequent enemies. The result is catastrophe. Gin floods the slums of London and other cities. It's incredibly cheap, cheaper than beer, cheaper than food. It's also incredibly strong. The slogan "drunk for a penny, dead drunk for tuppence" Clean Straw for Nothing describes the gin shops where people can get roaring drunk for almost no money and then sleep it off on straw provided by the establishment. The social consequences are apocalyptic. Infant mortality soars because mothers drink through pregnancy and infancy. Children are neglected, abused, sold for gin money. Crime increases. Prostitution increases. Productivity collapses. The death rate in London exceeds the birth rate. The city's population is declining because gin is killing people faster than they can reproduce. William Hogarth's famous engraving Gin Lane, published in 1751, depicts a hell's cape of addiction. A drunk mother dropping her baby over a railing, a man and woman reduced to skeletons, a dog gnawing on a bone, a man hanging himself in the background, buildings collapsing, bodies piled in alleyways. In the foreground, a man and woman sit on steps, emaciated and dying, surrounded by the tools of their trades which they've sold for gin. The only thriving businesses are the pawn shop, the undertaker, and the gin shop itself. The engraving is paired with Beer Street, which shows healthy, prosperous people drinking beer, the implication being that beer is wholesome while gin is poison. The British government eventually responds with the Gin Acts of 1736 and 1751, which heavily tax and regulate gin production. Riots break out. People are furious that their cheap source of oblivion is being taken away. But gradually the laws work. Gin consumption drops. The death rate stabilizes. The worst of the crisis passes. But the pattern has been established. Cheap, strong. Alcohol causes social disaster. Regulation can reduce harm but is politically difficult and meets resistance. The government's role is ambiguous, sometimes regulator, sometimes profiteer. And the people most harmed are always the poor, because they have the least resources to resist addiction and the least access to treatment or support. This pattern will repeat many times. The Industrial Revolution, beginning in the late 18th century and accelerating through the 19th, creates new contexts for alcohol and new problems. Urbanization pulls people from villages where drinking happened within communal and familial structures into cities where they're anonymous and isolated. Factory work is brutal. 12, 14, 16-hour days in dangerous conditions, repetitive labor, constant supervision, low wages. Workers live in overcrowded slums with terrible sanitation. No privacy, no comfort. Alcohol becomes an escape. But drunkenness and industrial machinery are a lethal combination. Workers show up drunk and suffer horrific injuries. Crushed limbs, severed fingers, scalped by exposed gears. Factory owners begin to care about alcohol consumption not out of moral concern but because drunk workers are expensive. They're injured more, they work less efficiently, they damage equipment. At the same time, the temperance movement is born. It starts in the United States in the early 19th century, spreads to Britain, Canada, Scandinavia, Australia, New Zealand. The movement is driven by several factors. Evangelical Protestant Christianity is experiencing a revival, and these Christians believe in personal moral reform and social improvement. They see alcohol as sin, as a barrier between humans and God, as a source of moral corruption. Women's groups join the movement because they bear the brunt of alcohol's harms. Husbands who drink away the family's money, domestic violence, children going hungry because their father spends his wages at the tavern. Physicians join because they're seeing alcohol-related diseases, cirrhosis, delirium tremens, alcohol poisoning. Social reformers join because they see alcohol as a root cause of poverty, crime, and social dysfunction. The American Temperance Society is founded in 1826. Within a decade, thousands of Americans have signed pledges to abstain from distilled spirits. Initially, most temperance advocates focus on spirits, not beer or wine, and they promote moderation rather than total abstinence. But gradually the movement radicalizes. Temperance becomes teetotalism, no alcohol of any kind, ever, under any circumstances. The argument shifts from personal choice to social necessity. Temperance advocates argue that alcohol is inherently evil, that even small amounts lead inevitably to addiction, that drinking isn't a private matter but a public health crisis requiring legal intervention. And they have evidence. The level of alcohol consumption in the 19th century is staggering. In the United States in 1830, the average American adult drinks 7 gallons of pure alcohol per year. more than 3 times the current rate. That's not total liquid, that's pure alcohol. People are drinking whiskey at breakfast. Farm workers are drinking throughout the day. Businessmen conduct transactions over drinks. Alcohol is everywhere, in everything, constantly. The country is, by modern standards, collectively drunk. Temperance lecturers travel from town to town giving dramatic presentations, often featuring reformed drunkards who tell their stories of degradation and redemption. They describe the suffering of alcoholic families, the abuse of wives and children, the financial ruin. They show anatomical diagrams of diseased livers. They distribute pamphlets with titles like The Drunkard's Progress, showing a man's descent from respectable citizen to destitute criminal to corpse. The movement is enormously effective at shaping public opinion. Temperance becomes a mass movement. In the United States, entire towns vote to go dry, banning the sale of alcohol within their borders. States pass local option laws allowing counties to prohibit alcohol. Kansas becomes the first state to completely prohibit alcohol in 1881. By 1916, before national prohibition, more than half of Americans live in areas where alcohol sales are illegal. The movement spreads internationally. In Britain, temperance societies attract millions of members. In Scandinavia, alcohol consumption drops as governments implement restrictions and rationing systems. In Russia, Tsar Nicholas II restricts vodka sales during World War I, believing that a sober population will be more productive and easier to govern. An ironic decision given that vodka taxes are a huge part of government revenue. The temperance movement is also linked to other progressive causes: women's suffrage, labor reform, abolitionism. Many of the same people who fight for voting rights for women also fight for prohibition. The logic is clear. Women can't protect themselves or their children from alcoholic husbands through the law because they don't have political power. So gaining the vote and banning alcohol are connected goals. Carrie Nation becomes one of the most famous temperance activists. She's a tall, imposing woman who walks into saloons in Kansas with a hatchet and literally destroys them, smashing bottles, barrels, mirrors, furniture. She's arrested dozens of times. She becomes a national celebrity. Her message is simple and uncompromising: alcohol is evil, the men who sell it are criminals, and direct action is justified to stop them. By the second decade of the 20th century, the temperance movement is powerful enough to achieve its ultimate goal: national prohibition. Finland prohibits alcohol in 1919. The United States does the same in 1920 with the 18th Amendment to the Constitution and the Volstead Act, which provides enforcement mechanisms. Canada has various provincial prohibitions that vary by region and are gradually repealed. Norway, Iceland, and other countries implement their own bans. The theory is beautifully simple. Remove alcohol, and you remove the harm. No more addiction. No more domestic violence. No more poverty caused by men drinking their wages. No more industrial accidents from drunk workers. No more crime associated with saloons and drinking establishments. A new era of health, prosperity, and morality will dawn. Society will be perfected. The reality is catastrophe. Let's focus on the United States, because American prohibition from 1920 to 1933 becomes the most famous and most studied example of this failed experiment in social engineering. From the moment prohibition begins, it becomes clear that making something illegal doesn't make it disappear. It just drives it underground and makes it more dangerous. Almost immediately, a massive black market emerges. People brew beer in their basements. They distill whiskey in hidden stills in the mountains of Appalachia and the rural South. They convert industrial alcohol, which continues to be legally produced for manufacturing and medical purposes, into drinkable spirits through various chemical processes. They smuggle liquor across the Canadian border, across the Mexican border, by boat from the Caribbean and from ships anchored offshore. Speakeasies, illegal bars, open in every major city. In New York City alone, estimates suggest there are 30,000 speakeasies during Prohibition, more than twice the number of legal saloons before the ban. These aren't secret. Everyone knows where they are. You knock on an unmarked door, a slot opens, you give a password, you're admitted to a crowded room where liquor flows freely. The police know where they are too, but enforcement is sporadic and often corrupt. and organized crime takes over the alcohol trade. Before Prohibition, criminal gangs existed in American cities, but they were relatively small-time, focused on local rackets like gambling, prostitution, and theft. Prohibition creates an opportunity for massive profit, and gangsters seize it with both hands. The alcohol black market is worth billions of dollars. Controlling it means controlling enormous wealth and power. In Chicago, Al Capone builds an empire on bootlegging. His organization smuggles liquor from Canada, operates breweries and distilleries hidden in warehouses, distributes alcohol to thousands of speakeasies and private buyers. At the peak of his power in the late 1920s, Capone's organization generates an estimated $60 million a year, nearly $1 billion in today's money, from bootlegging and related criminal enterprises. He lives in luxury, bribes politicians and police officers, and eliminates rivals through intimidation and murder. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre in 1929 epitomizes Prohibition-era violence. Capone's men, disguised as police officers, line up 7 members of a rival gang against a garage wall in Chicago and execute them with machine guns in broad daylight. The brutality shocks the nation. This isn't crime as Americans knew it. This is something new, organized, efficient, ruthless, operating at a scale and with a violence that seems almost military. But Capone is just one example. Across the country, Prohibition fuels gang wars, corruption, and violence. In New York, crime families fight for control of bootlegging territories. In Detroit, the Purple Gang dominates the liquor trade coming from Canada across the river and the Great Lakes. In Kansas City, the Pendergast political machine runs the city with the cooperation of bootleggers and criminals. In smaller cities and towns, local gangsters and corrupt sheriffs work together to keep the liquor flowing while maintaining a facade of enforcement. Law enforcement is overwhelmed. The Prohibition Bureau, the federal agency responsible for enforcement, never has more than 3,000 agents to police a country of more than 100 million people with thousands of miles of borders and coastline. Many of these agents are poorly trained, poorly paid, and easily corrupted. Stories abound of Prohibition agents accepting bribes, working with bootleggers, even running their own illegal operations. Meanwhile, the alcohol people are drinking during Prohibition is often more dangerous than what they drank before. Without regulation or quality control, bootleggers use whatever ingredients are available and whatever methods are fastest and most profitable. Industrial alcohol is redistilled to remove poisonous additives, but the process is often incomplete. Moonshine is produced in makeshift stills using questionable ingredients. Liquor is diluted with water or other substances to increase volume. The result is alcohol that can be toxic. Thousands of people die from poisoning during Prohibition. Thousands more go blind or suffer permanent neurological damage from drinking methanol-contaminated liquor. Hospitals see waves of victims with symptoms ranging from nausea and headaches to convulsions, blindness, and death. Some of this is accidental, bootleggers who don't understand chemistry. Some is criminally negligent, bootleggers who don't care. And some is actually caused by the government. In one of the most shameful episodes of Prohibition, the US government, frustrated that bootleggers are stealing industrial alcohol and redistilling it into beverages, orders manufacturers to add even more poisonous chemicals to industrial alcohol to make it impossible to purify. The government knows that people are drinking this alcohol. The government knows that adding more poison will kill more people. They do it anyway, reasoning that the deaths will deter people from drinking illegal liquor. Estimates suggest that 10,000 people die from government-poisoned alcohol during Prohibition. It's a policy of deliberate poisoning that amounts to state-sanctioned murder. And here's the ultimate irony. Prohibition doesn't even stop people from drinking. Consumption drops sharply when Prohibition first begins in 1920, probably by about 30 to 50%. But then it rebounds as the illegal market develops. By the late 1920s, alcohol consumption is estimated to be at about 70 to 80% of pre-Prohibition levels. The law is failing on every front. It's not reducing drinking significantly. It's enriching criminals. It's corrupting police and politicians. It's killing people through poisoning and violence. And it's costing the government enormous amounts of money in enforcement while eliminating the tax revenue that alcohol had previously generated. Public opinion shifts. The same groups that pushed for prohibition, that believed it would usher in a moral utopia, now see the disaster it has caused. The Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform, founded in 1929, argues that prohibition is actually harming families by filling cities with crime and violence. Business leaders argue that legalizing alcohol would create jobs and tax revenue during the Great Depression. Law enforcement officials argue that prohibition is unenforceable and is undermining respect for all laws. The Great Depression, which begins with the stock market crash in 1929, accelerates the movement to repeal prohibition. The economy is in shambles. Unemployment is approaching 25%. The government desperately needs revenue. Legalizing and taxing alcohol suddenly looks like an economic necessity as well as a social one. In 1932, Franklin Delano Roosevelt runs for president on a platform that includes repealing prohibition. He wins in a landslide. In 1933, the 21st Amendment is ratified, repealing the 18th Amendment and ending prohibition after 13 years. The experiment is over. Alcohol is legal again. But the legacy remains. Organized crime networks built during prohibition don't just disappear when alcohol is legalized. The infrastructure, the connections, the money, it all stays in place. The mafia and other criminal organizations move into other businesses: gambling, drugs, labor racketeering, legitimate businesses that can be used for money laundering. The power and wealth that organized crime accumulates during prohibition shapes American crime for the rest of the century. The failure of prohibition also shapes policy debates for the next 100 years. Every time someone proposes criminalizing a substance, someone else brings up prohibition as an example of how criminalization can backfire, how it can create black markets, empower criminals, lead to violence and corruption, and fail to achieve its intended goals. The lesson seems clear: prohibition doesn't work. But that doesn't mean the problems go away. Alcohol remains a major public health issue, perhaps even more so once it's legal again because it's now openly available and aggressively marketed. In the mid-20th century, the alcohol industry rebuilds after prohibition. Breweries and distilleries consolidate. Small local producers are bought by larger companies or go out of business. Brands become national. Advertising becomes more sophisticated. Radio and then television bring alcohol advertising into every home. The industry learns from prohibition. They carefully cultivate an image of respectability and responsibility. They fund campaigns against drunk driving. They promote moderation messaging, drink responsibly, know when to say when. They distance themselves from the worst excesses while still encouraging consumption. It's a delicate balance, and they walk it skillfully. World War II brings its own alcohol-related issues. Soldiers drink heavily to cope with combat stress and trauma. Military rations include cigarettes and sometimes alcohol. Soldiers stationed in Europe and Asia are exposed to local drinking cultures. After the war, veterans return home, many with what we now recognize as PTSD, and many self-medicate with alcohol. The 1940s and 50s see rising alcoholism rates, particularly among men. The 1950s and 60s see the rise of the modern alcoholism treatment movement. Alcoholics Anonymous, founded in 1935 by Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob Smith, grows from a small group meeting in basements to an international organization with millions of members. AA's approach is based on the disease model. Alcoholism is an illness, not a moral failing. Recovery requires admitting powerlessness, seeking help from a higher power, and supporting others in recovery. The 12 steps become the foundation of addiction treatment for alcohol and later for other substances. Medical understanding of alcoholism advances. Researchers identify genetic factors that increase vulnerability to addiction. They study the neuroscience of dependence, how chronic alcohol use changes brain chemistry, making it difficult to stop even when the person wants to. They develop medications that can help: disulfiram, antabuse, which makes people sick if they drink; naltrexone, which reduces cravings; acamprosate, which helps with withdrawal symptoms. But treatment remains limited. Insurance often doesn't cover it. Stigma keeps people from seeking help. Recovery resources are scarce. Many alcoholics never get treatment, never find AA or other support groups, never recover. They drink themselves to death quietly, over years or decades, destroying their health, their relationships, their lives. The 1960s and 70s see changing drinking patterns. Young people, particularly college students, embrace binge drinking as part of campus culture. Fraternities hold parties where the goal is to drink as much as possible as quickly as possible. Drinking games proliferate. Every year, students die from alcohol poisoning at these parties. They pass out, vomit, choke, and die while their friends think they're just sleeping it off. At the same time, concerns about drunk driving rise. Cars are faster and more common than ever. Highways crisscross the country, and drunk drivers are killing people at alarming rates. Through the 1960s and 70s, drunk driving is treated relatively leniently by the legal system. People caught driving drunk might lose their license temporarily or pay a fine, but serious punishment is rare even for repeat offenders. That changes in 1980 when Mothers Against Drunk Driving is founded by Candy Lightner after her 13-year-old daughter Carrie is killed by a hit-and-run drunk driver who had multiple previous DUI convictions and was out on bail from another hit-and-run just 2 days earlier. The driver receives 2 years in prison, a sentence that outrages Lightner and motivates her to start MAD. MAD becomes one of the most effective advocacy organizations in American history. They push for stricter laws, mandatory jail time for DUI convictions, immediate license suspension, lower legal blood alcohol limits, sobriety checkpoints. They lobby state legislatures and Congress. They run public awareness campaigns showing the devastating consequences of drunk driving. Their slogan, "Friends Don't Let Friends Drive Drunk," enters the cultural lexicon. The campaigns work. Drunk driving deaths, which peaked in the early 1980s at over 25,000 per year in the United States, dropped by more than half over the next 3 decades. Stricter laws, better enforcement, changing social norms, all of it contributes. Drunk driving goes from being socially acceptable, something people joke about, to being socially stigmatized. It becomes shameful to drive drunk, and friends intervene to stop it. But alcohol addiction continues to destroy lives. In the Soviet Union during the 1970s and 80s, alcohol abuse is epidemic. The average Soviet man consumes more than 15 liters of pure alcohol per year, one of the highest rates in the world. Vodka is cheap, widely available, and culturally central. Russian men drink to celebrate, to commute, to cope with the grinding absurdity and hardship of Soviet life. Mikhail Gorbachev tries to address the problem in the mid-1980s with an anti-alcohol campaign. He restricts vodka sales, raises prices, destroys vineyards, limits production. The initial results look promising. Alcohol consumption drops, life expectancy increases slightly, workplace accidents decline. But the campaign is deeply unpopular. People resent being told not to drink. They brew their own alcohol or buy it on the black market. The government loses enormous tax revenue. By the end of the 1980s, the campaign is abandoned. After the Soviet Union collapses in 1991, Russia experiences a demographic catastrophe. Life expectancy for Russian men plummets from 64 years in 1990 to less than 58 years in 1994. This is unprecedented, a developed country experiencing a decline in life expectancy of this magnitude in peacetime. The primary cause is alcohol. Alcohol-related deaths, cirrhosis, alcohol poisoning, accidents, violence, suicide, skyrocket. Russian men are drinking themselves to death en masse. The situation stabilizes somewhat in the 2000s, but Russia still has one of the highest rates of alcohol-related mortality in the world. The cultural acceptance of heavy drinking, the lack of effective treatment, the economic instability and social despair, all of it contributes to an ongoing crisis. In Native American communities in the United States and indigenous communities worldwide, alcohol remains a devastating scourge. The historical trauma of colonization, combined with poverty, lack of educational and economic opportunities, and limited access to healthcare and addiction treatment, creates conditions where alcoholism rates are extraordinarily high. On some reservations, life expectancy is decades below the national average, and alcohol is a major factor. Fetal alcohol syndrome affects indigenous children at rates far higher than the general population. Some tribal governments ban alcohol sales on reservations, hoping to reduce harm. But prohibition doesn't work at the local level any better than it worked nationally. People just drive to the nearest border town to buy alcohol, often binge drinking before making the drive home, leading to fatal accidents. The cycle continues, generation after generation, and solutions remain elusive. In the late 20th century, researchers start quantifying alcohol's harms more comprehensively. The World Health Organization estimates that alcohol contributes to more than 3 million deaths per year globally, 5.3% of all deaths. It's a factor in liver disease, heart disease, digestive diseases, cancer, stroke, infections, injuries, violence, self-harm. It's involved in half of all homicides, assaults, and domestic violence incidents. It costs economies hundreds of billions in lost productivity, healthcare expenses, criminal justice costs, and property damage. Yet alcohol remains legal, socially accepted, culturally embedded. Why? The answer is complicated. Part of it is that unlike most drugs, alcohol use isn't binary. Most people who drink don't become addicted. They drink moderately, occasionally, socially. For them, alcohol enhances life. It facilitates celebration, relaxation, connection. The harms, while real and significant, are concentrated in a minority of drinkers. Part of it is cultural and religious tradition. Wine in Christian communion, sake in Shinto rituals, alcohol in countless ceremonies and celebrations across cultures. Removing alcohol would require dismantling traditions that stretch back millennia. That's not impossible, but it's extremely difficult. Part of it is economic. The alcohol industry is enormous. Beer, wine, and spirits companies are worth hundreds of billions of dollars, employ millions of people, generate massive tax revenue for governments. Prohibition would destroy all of that, and no government wants to take that economic hit. And part of it is the lesson of prohibition. Criminalizing alcohol doesn't work. It creates black markets, empowers criminals, leads to dangerous unregulated products, and doesn't actually stop people from drinking. If prohibition isn't the answer, then we're left with regulation, taxation, education, and treatment as tools to minimize harm while accepting that alcohol isn't going away. Let's talk about what alcohol actually does to the body and brain in more detail, because understanding the science helps explain why this substance is so seductive and so dangerous, why some people can drink moderately for a lifetime without problems while others become addicted and destroyed. Alcohol, specifically ethanol, is a small molecule that easily crosses biological membranes. When you drink an alcoholic beverage, ethanol is absorbed through the stomach lining and especially through the small intestine into the bloodstream. From there, it's distributed throughout the body, reaching every organ, every tissue, every cell. Within minutes of drinking, ethanol reaches the brain. In the brain, ethanol has multiple effects. It enhances the activity of GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, the brain's primary inhibitory neurotransmitter. GABA tells neurons to slow down, to fire less frequently. When GABA activity is enhanced by alcohol, the result is a general suppression of brain activity, reduced anxiety, muscle relaxation, sedation, slowed reflexes. At the same time, alcohol suppresses glutamate, the brain's primary excitatory neurotransmitter. Glutamate tells neurons to speed up, to be more active. Suppressing glutamate adds to the overall dampening effect on brain activity. At low doses, these effects feel pleasant. You feel relaxed. Your social anxiety decreases. You feel more confident, more talkative. Worries recede. Stress fades. This is why people drink at parties, at dinners, after work. Alcohol is a social lubricant that makes interaction easier and more enjoyable. But as the dose increases, the effects progress from pleasant to problematic to dangerous. Motor control deteriorates. You become clumsy, your movements less coordinated. Speech slurs. Balance becomes difficult. Judgment is impaired. Decisions that would seem obviously stupid sober seem reasonable when drunk. Inhibitions drop, and people do things they would never do sober. Get in fights, have unprotected sex, drive cars, say things they later regret. At high doses, Alcohol suppresses the brainstem functions that control breathing and heart rate. If blood alcohol concentration gets high enough, breathing can stop. This is alcohol poisoning, and it can be fatal. Every year, people, often young people at parties, drink enormous amounts in a short time, pass out, vomit, and if they're lying on their back, they aspirate the vomit and choke to death. Or their breathing simply stops. Friends think they're sleeping it off, but they're actually dying. Chronic heavy drinking causes cascading damage. The liver is the organ that metabolizes alcohol, breaking ethanol down into acetaldehyde, a toxic compound, and then into acetic acid, which can be used for energy. But the liver can only process alcohol at a certain rate, roughly 1 standard drink per hour. Drink faster than that, and the alcohol accumulates in the bloodstream. Over time, chronic drinking damages the liver. Initially, fat accumulates in liver cells, fatty liver disease. Then the liver becomes inflamed, alcoholic hepatitis. Then scar tissue forms, fibrosis. Eventually, the scarring becomes extensive, cirrhosis. At this point, the liver can't function properly. Toxins accumulate in the blood. The abdomen fills with fluid. Veins in the esophagus become enlarged and can rupture, causing life-threatening bleeding. The only treatment for advanced cirrhosis is a liver transplant, but alcoholics are often low priority for transplants. Alcohol damages the brain. Chronic heavy drinking causes brain shrinkage, neurons die, particularly in areas involved in memory and executive function. Alcoholics experience cognitive decline, memory problems, difficulty with planning and decision-making. Wernicke-Korsakoff syndrome, caused by severe thiamine deficiency common in alcoholics who don't eat properly, leads to permanent brain damage, severe memory impairment, and confabulation. The brain fills in missing memories with fabrications. Alcohol increases cancer risk, cancers of the mouth, throat, esophagus, liver, breast, colon. The risk increases with the amount consumed. Even moderate drinking increases cancer risk, though the increase is small. Heavy drinking dramatically increases risk. Alcohol damages the heart, causing cardiomyopathy. The heart muscle weakens and can't pump blood effectively. It causes arrhythmias, irregular heartbeats that can be fatal. It increases blood pressure, increasing the risk of stroke. Alcohol weakens the immune system, making infections more likely and more severe. It causes nutritional deficiencies. Alcoholics often don't eat properly, and alcohol interferes with absorption of vitamins and nutrients. It damages the pancreas, causing pancreatitis, an excruciatingly painful inflammation. It damages nerves throughout the body. Alcoholic neuropathy causes numbness, tingling, pain. And then there's addiction. Alcohol is one of the most addictive substances known, though not everyone who drinks becomes addicted. Estimates suggest that about 10 to 15% of people who drink develop alcohol use disorder, though rates vary by genetics, environment, and other factors. Addiction happens because alcohol hijacks the brain's reward system. The brain has evolved to reinforce behaviors that promote survival, eating, sex, social bonding. When you do these things, your brain releases dopamine, a neurotransmitter that makes you feel good, and the behavior is reinforced. Alcohol triggers dopamine release, which is part of why drinking feels good. But with repeated exposure, the brain adapts. It becomes less sensitive to dopamine. You need more alcohol to get the same effect, tolerance. At the same time, the brain becomes dependent on alcohol to function. Normally, without it, you feel anxious, irritable, unable to relax. This is psychological dependence. Physical dependence develops when the brain's chemistry has been altered to compensate for the constant presence of alcohol. The brain increases glutamate activity and decreases GABA activity to counteract alcohol's effects. Now when alcohol is removed, the brain is unbalanced in the opposite direction. Too much excitation, not enough inhibition. This is withdrawal, and for alcohol, withdrawal can be severe and even fatal. Alcohol withdrawal symptoms include anxiety, tremors, sweating, nausea, hallucinations, seizures, and in severe cases, delirium tremens, a condition of profound confusion, hallucinations, autonomic instability, and seizures that can be fatal. Alcohol is one of only two substances. The other is benzodiazepines, where withdrawal can directly kill you. This is why detoxing from alcohol should be medically supervised. Alcoholism, what we now call alcohol use disorder, ruins lives in predictable patterns. Initially, drinking provides relief, pleasure, confidence. But gradually, tolerance builds and more alcohol is needed. Drinking starts to interfere with responsibilities. Work performance declines, relationships suffer. The person drinks to cope with stress, to feel normal, not just to feel good. They try to cut back or stop but find they can't. Withdrawal symptoms appear. They drink to avoid withdrawal, and the cycle tightens. As addiction progresses, alcohol becomes the center of life. Work may be lost. Relationships may end. Health deteriorates. Legal problems arise, DUIs, public intoxication, alcohol-related violence. The person may hit what's called rock bottom, losing everything, or they may function for years as a high-functioning alcoholic, maintaining appearances while slowly destroying themselves. Families of alcoholics suffer enormously. Children growing up with an alcoholic parent grow up in chaos and unpredictability. They experience neglect, often abuse. They may become hypervigilant, unable to relax, always waiting for the next crisis. They may develop their own addiction issues or mental health problems. The trauma can last a lifetime and affect their own parenting, continuing the cycle. Spouses of alcoholics face impossible choices. They love the person but hate the addiction. They enable, they plead, they threaten, they leave, they come back. Many spend years trying to save someone who won't or can't be saved. Codependency develops. The spouse's identity becomes wrapped up in managing the alcoholic's behavior. Recovery is possible, but it's difficult. The most effective approach is usually a combination of treatment, medical detox if needed, therapy, medication to reduce cravings, and peer support through groups like AA. But relapse is common. Addiction is a chronic disease, and like other chronic diseases, it often requires ongoing management. Now let's move into the 21st century and look at current patterns and emerging issues. In the West, overall alcohol consumption has been relatively stable or slightly declining over the past few decades. But within that overall trend, there are concerning patterns. Binge drinking, consuming large amounts in a single session, remains common, especially among young adults. Emergency rooms see a steady stream of alcohol poisonings, injuries from drunk falls and fights, victims of alcohol-fueled assaults. There's also been a rise in what's sometimes called high-functioning alcoholism, particularly among professionals, parents, and people under chronic stress. These are people who drink wine every night, not to get drunk, but to relax, to decompress, to cope with anxiety and pressure. It starts innocently, one glass of wine with dinner. Then it's 2 glasses. Then a bottle. Then it's happening every night, and the person realizes they can't sleep without it. They feel anxious without it. They need it to feel normal. This pattern of daily drinking can quietly escalate into dependence without the dramatic bottom-out stories associated with stereotypical alcoholism. There's no DUI, no job loss, no public scene. Just a person slowly becoming dependent on alcohol to function, their health slowly deteriorating, their life slowly constricting around the need to drink. Women's drinking rates have been rising faster than men's in recent decades. Historically, women drank much less than men, but that gap has been narrowing. Alcohol companies have aggressively marketed to women. Wine marketed as a treat, as self-care, as a reward for getting through the day. The mommy needs wine culture treats daily drinking as normal and even necessary for managing the stress of parenting and modern life. But women are more vulnerable to alcohol's harms. They develop liver disease and other alcohol-related health problems at lower levels of consumption than men, partly because of differences in body composition and metabolism. And alcohol during pregnancy causes fetal alcohol syndrome, leading to permanent developmental and cognitive disabilities in children. The COVID-19 pandemic, which began in late 2019 and dominated life through 2020 and 2021, worsened alcohol problems globally. Lockdowns, social isolation, economic anxiety, fear of illness, disruption of routines, all of it drove many people to drink more. Alcohol sales surged, particularly online sales. Emergency room visits for alcohol-related issues increased. Relapses among recovering alcoholics spiked as support meetings moved online or stopped altogether. The pandemic revealed how fragile sobriety can be and how deeply people rely on alcohol as a coping mechanism when life becomes unbearable. It also revealed how normalized drinking has become. People joked about day drinking during lockdown, about wine o'clock starting earlier and earlier, but behind the jokes was real harm. Now, in the 2020s, there's an interesting countertrend: sobriety as a lifestyle choice. The sober-curious movement encourages people to examine their relationship with alcohol and consider reducing or eliminating it, not because they're addicts, but because they want better health, better sleep, clearer thinking, more energy, better mental health. Books like Quit Like a Woman and This Naked Mind become bestsellers. Influencers share their sobriety journeys on social media. Mocktail bars open in major cities, bars that serve sophisticated non-alcoholic drinks in social atmospheres, offering the experience of going out without the alcohol. Non-alcoholic spirits and beers that actually taste good hit the market. These aren't just soda or juice, they're sophisticated products that mimic the complexity and flavor of alcohol without the ethanol. This is a remarkable cultural shift. For the first time in modern history, in some circles, not drinking is becoming cool, aspirational. Sobriety is framed not as deprivation but as optimization, as taking control of your health and your life. It's too early to say whether this is a lasting trend or a niche phenomenon, but it represents a growing awareness that alcohol isn't harmless, that the costs might outweigh the benefits even for people who don't have a drinking problem. At the same time, global alcohol consumption is rising, particularly in Asia. In China, as the country has become wealthier over the past 4 decades, alcohol consumption has skyrocketed. Baijiu, a strong clear distilled spirit made from sorghum or other grains, is the most consumed liquor in the world by volume. Business. Culture in China involves heavy drinking. Refusing a drink from a superior or a client is considered rude. So people drink far more than they want to, and alcohol-related health problems are rising rapidly. In South Korea, soju is ubiquitous. South Korea has one of the highest per capita alcohol consumption rates in Asia. Drinking culture is intense, especially in business and social settings. There's enormous pressure to drink with colleagues and bosses. Declining is difficult without causing offense. The result is that many Koreans drink heavily multiple nights per week. In India, alcohol consumption has been rising despite traditional religious and cultural taboos against drinking, especially among Hindus and Muslims. But urbanization, rising incomes, Western cultural influence, and aggressive marketing by alcohol companies are changing behaviors, particularly among the urban middle class and young people. Alcohol-related harms are increasing: road accidents, domestic violence, health problems. In Africa, industrially produced beer is replacing traditional fermented beverages, and multinational alcohol companies are aggressively marketing their products in countries with young, growing populations and relatively weak regulation. Public health experts warn that Africa could be facing an alcohol crisis in the coming decades as consumption patterns shift and alcohol becomes more available and more heavily marketed. And then there's a new danger that's emerged in the last few years: adulteration and contamination of alcohol, particularly in the developing world, causing mass poisonings. Methanol is a type of alcohol that's chemically similar to ethanol but is extremely toxic. Drinking even small amounts can cause blindness, organ failure, and death. Ethanol is produced by fermenting sugars with yeast. Methanol is produced industrially and is used as a solvent and fuel. It's cheaper than ethanol, and unscrupulous or ignorant producers sometimes add it to alcoholic beverages to increase profit margins or because they don't understand the difference. In the past decade, there have been numerous mass poisoning events from methanol-contaminated alcohol. In India, in 2015, more than 100 people died in a single incident from drinking illegally produced liquor contaminated with methanol. In Indonesia, in 2018, more than 100 people died from methanol-poisoned bootleg alcohol. In Kenya, in 2020, dozens died. In Mexico, tourists have died from methanol-contaminated alcohol at resorts. In some cases, it's accidental, illegal producers who don't understand chemistry and don't know the difference between ethanol and methanol. In other cases, it's criminally negligent. Producers who know methanol is dangerous but use it anyway because it's cheaper. Either way, the result is tragedy. People going blind, dying, suffering organ failure. This is a reminder that when alcohol is produced outside regulated systems, whether because of prohibition or weak regulation or criminal activity, the risks multiply. It's yet another echo of the lessons of prohibition. When you drive a market underground, you lose quality control and people die. Meanwhile, the alcohol industry is more powerful and more global than ever. Multinational corporations control most major beer, wine, and spirits brands. Anheuser-Busch InBev, Heineken, Diageo, Pernod Ricard. These companies have annual revenues in the tens of billions and operations in dozens of countries. They spend billions on marketing, lobbying, and sponsorships. They sponsor sports leagues, music festivals, cultural events. Their advertising is sophisticated and effective. They also fund research designed to downplay alcohol's harms and emphasize potential benefits. For years, the industry promoted the idea that moderate drinking, especially red wine, is good for your heart, citing studies that showed correlations between moderate alcohol consumption and reduced risk of heart disease. But more recent and more rigorous research has challenged these findings, showing that the apparent benefits were likely due to confounding factors. People who drink moderately also tend to be wealthier, better educated, have better access to healthcare, and engage in other healthy behaviors. Current scientific consensus is moving toward the conclusion that there is no safe level of alcohol consumption, that even moderate drinking increases the risk of cancer and other health problems. A 2018 study published in The Lancet analyzed data from hundreds of other studies and concluded that the optimal amount of alcohol for health is 0. Public health advocates argue that alcohol should be regulated more like tobacco, heavily taxed, with restrictions on advertising, plain packaging, graphic health warnings, and funding for prevention and treatment programs. They point to evidence that higher prices reduce consumption, especially among young people and heavy drinkers. They point to research showing that advertising restrictions reduce youth drinking. The alcohol industry, unsurprisingly, opposes these measures. They argue that most people drink responsibly, that the harms are caused by a small minority of problem drinkers, that excessive regulation punishes responsible consumers, and that education and personal responsibility are better approaches than regulation. The battle continues, fought in legislatures, in courts, in public health journals, in the media. So where does all this leave us? Here in the 2020s, 10,000 years after humans first discovered fermentation. Alcohol is more present, more available, more globalized than ever. It's sold in grocery stores, gas stations, airports, restaurants, bars, stadiums. It's advertised during sports games, in magazines, online. It's in movies, TV shows, music videos. It's glamorized and normalized to a degree that would be unthinkable for almost any other addictive drug. At the same time, we understand its harms better than ever. We know how it damages the body and brain. We know who is most vulnerable. We know how to treat addiction. We know what policies reduce harm. We have the knowledge. The question is whether we have the will to implement it. The history of alcohol is ultimately the history of humanity wrestling with pleasure and pain, freedom and control, connection and isolation, joy and destruction. It's the story of a substance that offers something we deeply want: relaxation, confidence, social bonding, escape from suffering. But that exacts a terrible price from too many people. And that story isn't over. It continues every day, in every country, in every community, in individual lives. Someone wakes up hungover and swears never again. Someone pours their first drink of the day at breakfast. Someone celebrates a promotion with champagne. Someone hits rock bottom and calls for help. Someone relapses after years of sobriety. Someone has one glass of wine with dinner and nothing more. Someone dies on an operating table waiting for a liver transplant. Someone drives drunk and kills a family. Someone finds community and belonging at an AA meeting. Someone becomes sober curious and discovers they don't need alcohol to have fun. Someone toasts their 50th wedding anniversary. The spirit that built empires and broke families is still here, still shaping our world, still demanding that we reckon with its power. What do we do with this knowledge? What do we do with this history? We could aim for a world with less alcohol consumption, less harm, better treatment for those who struggle, fewer lives cut short or diminished. We could implement policies that actually work, higher taxes, restricted marketing, better labeling, increased funding for treatment, harm reduction approaches. We could change culture so that not drinking is normalized, so that alcohol isn't seen as necessary for celebration or relaxation or fun. We could also recognize that prohibition isn't the answer, that trying to eliminate alcohol entirely creates more problems than it solves, that adults should be free to make their own choices even if those choices carry risks. We could acknowledge complexity, that alcohol is neither purely good nor purely evil, that it exists in the messy middle where most human things exist, that our relationship with it needs to be based on honesty, education, compassion, and pragmatism rather than moralism or denial. This is the complete history of alcohol, from the first fermented grain in a clay pot 10,000 years ago to the global industry and ongoing public health crisis of today. It's a story of human creativity and human weakness, of the things we create and the ways they change us. It's a story of connection and destruction, of celebration and suffering, of moments of transcendence and years of slow decline. It's a story that doesn't have an ending yet, because we're still living it. Because somewhere right now, someone is pouring a drink, and we don't yet know how their story will end. If you made it this far, thank you. You've just spent a significant amount of time exploring one of the most complex, consequential, and deeply human substances in history. If this resonated with you, if you learned something, if it made you think differently about that bottle in your cabinet or that glass in your hand, hit that subscribe button. Drop a like, and maybe share this with someone who needs to hear it. See you in the next one.